All right. Welcome to everyone. We are ready to start our Meet Your Legislators for lunch. So welcome to Greater Tuscaloosa lunch with your legislators. Let me just close this out. This event is co-sponsored by Ollie and Tuara. And just so everyone knows, we are live on Facebook and recording the event. It will be posted on our website, LWVTuscaloosa.org, at a later time. Recordings of this event may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio, video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media reporting of the event. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. So Senators Allen and Reed and Representative Sullivan send their regrets. They had a conflict for this lunchtime event. So let me introduce who we do have today. From the 63rd District, we have Representative Bill Poole. From the 70th District, we have Representative Chris England. And from the 16th District, we have Representative Kyle South. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. We are so excited to have you. So first, we would just like to hear what you consider to be the three greatest challenges facing the state and the three major things you see in this legislative session. So Mr. Poole, could you start for us?
Well, I think in terms of the three major challenges, and I would preface by saying just simply the logistical conduct of the session is going to be a challenge, which makes addressing the challenges we're going to talk about even more difficult to address in some sense, in light of the inability to communicate in person and in groups and with constituents and the public, so on and so forth. But in any event, that is the reality, and everybody will deal with it to the best of their ability. But I think the couple of challenges are pretty clear. I think first and foremost, the prison situation in the state of Alabama. I won't dive into that. I think certainly can if asked, but trying to guide our state forward as it relates to the Department of Corrections. Everybody knows we're facing federal lawsuits. Everybody knows the governor is moving forward with a construction plan, but whether you agree with building new prisons or not, in any event, simply building prisons isn't going to solve all of the problems. And so whether we do or don't agree with that, or whether it does or doesn't happen, that's only part of the issue. Secondarily, obviously, is the continuation of the virus, and really less a legislative issue, but vaccine distribution now is obviously a major issue in the state, a very significant challenge. I don't think anybody would tell you that the rollout has gone particularly well in Alabama for reasons, some that are to blame and some that to blame others, but the blame game really doesn't accomplish a whole lot at this point. I think we just got to get some things done and straightened out. And I'm certain there'll be some conversation related to that. And then I think there are a lot of other issues that will be addressed in the session, whether those are economic incentives, whether those are state budgets, which are shockingly and remarkably healthy. And I'd certainly like the opportunity to expand on that at some point during this meeting. But kind of making sure our economic recovery is on trajectory, that it is broad-based, that it doesn't leave groups or areas behind, that we're trying to right the ship on the education side as well. So I think those are a couple of the primary challenges and issues.
Great. Mr. England, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. First, thank you for having us. I think I say this every year, but this is like one of my favorite events, even in the virtual world, I guess. Um, but just kind of echo what Bill said. Um, Obviously, prison system is what's front and center right now because of the latest lawsuit and the conditions within it, and also because the conditions are evolving. We've got several issues bubbling up within our prison system. The COVID, the pandemic has kept us from having hearings. So we've got piling, our population is piling up in county jails all across the state. And we also don't really have a long-term plan in order to deal with those situations that are bubbling up all over the state of Alabama. But also the coronavirus, the pandemic is impacted everyone. So it's not like we're complaining, but figuring out a safe way to meet in February has been a challenge. Because if you can imagine opening up the state house to people all over the state and putting us all in rooms together and actually encouraging situations where people can't do it safely, it's really probably a bad idea. I think I speak for Bill and Kyle when I say that we don't really want to open that building up if the public can't be involved somehow and not just be there, but substantially involved, meaning they can impact legislation, give us information, and we're not passing budgets or passing legislation behind closed doors. And I think we're all sort of a little nervous about the session coming up and trying to figure out the best way to do that. And I think you'll also hear some discussion. Again, one thing that Bill mentioned, and I think it's positive, especially for the state of Alabama, is and a lot of areas can say this. Our budgets are doing remarkably well under the circumstances. I do think at some point in the future we'll probably have some impact from what we're seeing, but we were actually experiencing growth in our education trust fund through this pandemic, which is amazing. And we have always thought that the volatility of the market would have a substantial impact on both of our budgets, but we've actually seen our budgets are having remarkable sustainability and stability. I mean, it's been remarkable to see that, especially compared to other places that have had to borrow money and other things in order to keep the lights on. And so, and I think you'll probably see some discussion as we've always had in our past sessions about healthcare, and some, based upon our past elections, there may be some people who propose legislation dealing with election security, integrity, and voter access. So you'll probably see some discussion about that. But I'm pretty sure over the next few weeks, you'll probably start to hear some rumors and then ultimately more concrete things about how the legislature plans to manage this upcoming session, including, whether or not we stay in for a period of time and recess until we can get a better idea or get a better handle on the pandemic, and also determining what legislation is going to take priority and how we're going to do the budgets. So I think those are probably the three or four main things we'll be talking about this upcoming session.
Okay. Mr. South, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, so they pretty much covered everything. I want to echo Chris's sentiments. Appreciate the opportunity each and every year to join you guys, even if it's via video this year. So we will adjust to the times that we're in. But, one of my biggest issues, worries is access to the State House. Don't even know if doing hearings via video constitute an issue with how things move forward constitutionally and those kinds of things. So I think that's a big hurdle that we don't really have answers to, but we're trying to move through that the best we can. Last year we were to a point where we basically only focused on the budgets after we came back, and most of the work behind the scenes and the budget hearings and committee meetings, committee hearings had already been done before we broke for the coronavirus. So while we had some experience, it was a different set of circumstances last year as opposed to this year. So we'll move into that pretty quickly and have to adjust as we move forward. I do think there will be a short list of priorities when we go in the first few weeks, and the incentives for industrial recruitment and economic incentives. A piece of legislation dealing with liability issues as it concerns the coronavirus, and then also making sure that the citizens of the state are not taxed on any stimulus monies that have already been received or are to be received. So I think that's what we'll probably fire with coming out of the gate, and then we will proceed cautiously based on the circumstances given at the time.
Okay, great. So I'm really interested to talk about the budgets, but quickly before we do that, you mentioned the challenges with meeting associated with COVID. What about some of the talk we've heard recently? And I know you won't be in session at this point, but you know, last week there was a riot at the nation's capital, and there has been talk of each state capital also being in jeopardy this upcoming week. Are you concerned about your safety going forward with that regard, with extremist groups or whatever, and their intentions? Has there been any talk about that amongst the legislators? Anyone? Mr. Poole? Anyone?
Who wants to take that? I think there are already steps being taken, obviously security within the building and those kinds of things to ensure not only our safety, but safety of the public as it pertains to the building, and you know, demonstrations or you know, organized efforts outside that. So those steps have been taken. I think there's even some new security contracts that have been issued for the State House. So I think we have to be mindful of it. But personally, I don't have a huge concern as we move forward.
Sure. Yeah, we so there has been some threats that have been communicated around Sunday. There's a planned protest in Montgomery on Sunday, and obviously there's some concern about Inauguration Day. But as Kyle said, there have been measures that are taken. I think some members have also expressed some reservation about, you know, some of the things that they've been hearing. And across the country in several states that are actually in session, they're going to recess some of, I think in Wisconsin, for example, they have boarded up some of their windows. So I think considering what we saw last week, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be mindful of our security, but at the same time, I'm hopeful because I've called and I've talked to several members of our law enforcement here and up there, and Montgomery is taking measures to make sure that they're protected downtown and also at the State House. And luckily for all of us, we're not even going to be there until next month. So hopefully by the time we get there, some emotions and things will settle a little bit, and we'll be able to kind of focus on what we're there for.
I agree with everything Chris and Kyle have said. I won't belabor the point for sake of time, other than to say, you know, I think it is important that the legislature go back in and conduct, you know, COVID issues aside, but try to conduct business as normal. Can't stop doing the business of the state for any reason. And I think it's important that we demonstrate that we're going to be there together, doing the work of the people on a bipartisan basis, notwithstanding in agreements, and provide that example. So I agree with all of their comments. And I think it's important that we go back down and demonstrate that for our citizens.
Good. Well, we just want all of you to be safe. So let's delve into the budget a little bit. It's great news, obviously, that we have a healthy budget. The Alabama, I have to say, that's definitely good news. Is this going to allow for anything like Medicaid expansion or, any sort of extras, or kind of how do you see the budget being divided up? Mr. Poole?
Well, I'll jump in there relative to my role as it relates to education appropriations in the education budget. But, really, I think it's important for us all to recognize that it is remarkable and we're fortunate to be in this position we're in. In past economic downturns, our state has not fared well. I think all of you remember many of those. The last one in 2008 was devastating to our state's budgets. The legislature enacted a number of budget control mechanisms, adopted those by and large on bipartisan basis, have not breached those, which is in and of itself an accomplishment from a legislative standpoint, and I think they have served the state well. We have passed record education budgets for 2 consecutive years. The budget that we passed for this year in the midst of the coronavirus was a modest increase, but by consequence of an increase, it was the largest budget in the state of Alabama's history. Barring some massive unforeseen circumstance, we will do so again next year. And so where many states are cutting education budgets, pink slipping K-12 teachers, slashing higher education budgets, Georgia being one example, Michigan being a very cute example, and many, many others. We are not in that position. Both of our budgets are healthy. And I won't go way into it, but part of the reason is our economy. The education budget really reflects the economy because it's funded by income and sales taxes, thereby the volatility of your economic wins. But the budget was performing extraordinarily well during the first half of the last fiscal year. It was growing in excess of 7.5%, which are numbers I have not seen in my time and have not occurred for a while. During the second half of the year, once COVID hit, if you isolate that, it contracted by 1%. So when all of that balanced out, we had 2.5% growth in the education budget during FY20, which was acutely impacted by COVID. And we appropriated our 21 appropriations. And I know this is kind of confusing, but we collected more in FY20 than we appropriated in FY21, which would foreshadow that any growth will lead to increased capacity and that we can absorb negative consequences without cutting. And so notwithstanding the fact that we have a lot of problems caused by COVID and for a lot of other reasons, those problems would have been multiplied exponentially, but for our ability to sustain funding for education, for the Department of Mental Health, for the Department of Public Health, so on and so forth down the line. So we're fortunate that our problems were not multiplied by virtue of that. And we are fortunate that as we look forward, we will have resources and capacities to address needs. And gosh knows we got plenty of them. Now, it's going to be a very significant challenge, I think. Passing the budgets is always a challenge because it is such a monumental issue for the state and is so important to everybody in their area. There is so much federal money that is moving around right now, the education system, as well as a lot of our general fund agencies. So it's going to be a significant challenge to understand where are those dollars, how are they being used, how can we utilize a state dollar to leverage that rather than duplicate it. It's going to be a lot of discussion to that effect. I think this is going to bring a whole host of issues to the table, but it is important that we have opportunity as opposed to being in a negative position. And I'll wrap so that my colleagues have an opportunity to address their thoughts as well. But as I've made the point within this context, it doesn't apply to much broader context. So I don't want to misrepresent my point or for it to be misunderstood. But on this issue, as it relates to state budgets and our ability to fund education, this is an opportunity for our state, quite frankly, to improve its relative competitive position with other states. And I think we should embrace it as such in order to be positive, to find the positives, to push forward and try to be constructive and think long-term as well. I think it's remarkable, if not miraculous, that we are in the position that we are in. I think it's attributable to a lot of things. I could go down that road, but I'll reserve time for my colleagues.
Mr. South, do you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bill's right. It's amazing that we are where we are, especially when we compare ourselves to other states. Actually, a small amount of growth, both on the general fund side and the trust fund side. I apologize. Am I still there?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. But so small growth on both sides, but you know, the thing that we have to look at, especially from a general fund perspective, is how much additionally is the new prison plan going to cost us? You know, we've been allocating additional funds towards that each of the last 3 years to hire more guards and those kinds of things to satisfy the federal courts. But now we're moving from that into a position where we know construction is going to be a piece of that. And so what is the cost? What is the annual allocation to that? There's still a lot of questions out there. And then special projects, whether it be crisis centers for mental health that we started funding last year, but we know that that was just one step in the right direction. More of that is needed. So there's a lot of things on our wish list. It's just a matter of where we think we can get to in that.
Mr. England?
Yeah, both, I completely agree with both Kyle and Bill, and I'll take it just a step further. We always thought that there were structural deficiencies in both budgets in how we tax and spend. We've always thought that, and we were always concerned that there would be some sort of catastrophic event that would immediately put us in the red based upon the way we do tax and spend. So it was, again, it's been a shock to a lot of people that once our budgets were put in a very stressful and pressure situation, that the economy, Alabama's economy and our budgets actually responded positively. So it kind of changes your perspective in the sense that, you know, there is some confidence in the foundation that we set in both budgets, not suggesting that there doesn't need to be some structural changes made to it, but in a time of crisis, and when we are still enduring a crisis, that, you know, we can count on our budgets to sustain us and get us to a point where, you know, we can make it through it without having to do what other places have been doing. Now, with that being said, though, our expenses in the upcoming years, especially dealing with healthcare and our prison system, could begin to outpace a lot of other spending in other agencies. And there's a finite amount of money in those agencies. We don't get to print money. We don't get to necessarily borrow it like the federal government does. So we eventually have to make choices between priorities. And if you're facing a federal court system that's going to make a determination as to how you proceed, you could imagine there'll be a situation where the costs could be substantial when they're associated with not only building new facilities, but also responding to some of the demands of the court system. So you could imagine that right now, we'll just take Governor Ivey's plan that's been proposed. The floor on the amount of money, not the ceiling, but the floor, because she, in her negotiations, told the people who were proposing to build our 3 mega prisons that the ceiling was $80 million. Well, that would be a yearly payment that could potentially be renegotiated every year. So it could explode, meaning depending on what happens in the system, the cost, the management of it, that's one thing. But on the other side of it, as Kyle mentioned, we've already increased the appropriation to the Department of Corrections incrementally over the last 3 or 4 years to deal with other issues that were identified by the federal court system. And that's notwithstanding the fact that, you know, we just passed a bill, what I think it was last year, that we increased the amount of pay that we can offer incoming recruits so we can try to bring more people into work into the system. But we've also got an issue with how we, mental health. We've also got an issue with overcrowding. We've got an issue with conditions, and all those things are bubbling to the surface in this current lawsuit. And to make no mistake about it, the facts of the case that we've been presented with really haven't been disputed. Some of the things that were identified as issues with our prison system are harrowing. They're awful, and we're going to have to respond to those. Now, in other states, when these sorts of things happened, we entered into agreements and consent decrees with the federal government that gave us the ability to kind of manage the situation. So without having mass releases, giving us the opportunity to come up with our own responses to the issues that have been identified. But considering that we were given the opportunity, presented the evidence, and we didn't respond, I guess appropriately or accordingly, the lawsuit came, which is also going to provide more momentum for either more expenditures, more building, or more sentencing reform to release people, to release some of the pressure on our system itself. So the general fund specifically is going to be challenged in the sense that we don't know necessarily how much money it's going to take to satisfy the federal court system and to get us from the current situation that we're in right now. And the $80 million is just to build new facilities. We also have to incorporate the cost of maintaining the facilities that are open, that are going to remain open to keep or house the prisoners that we have now. And our last estimate that we were given, it was almost going to be $1 billion additionally to maintain and to manage the ones that we have now. The idea was we were going to close some in order to open others, but we still have to keep some of those open, and that's going to cost a lot of money. We're also going to be challenged on the healthcare side of that too, because it's not necessarily just the prison population itself, it's also the aging prison population and the cost of the healthcare associated with those incarcerated citizens is going to increase exponentially over the next few years, because again, it's an aging population, and just because they're incarcerated does not mean you don't have to treat them as humans. So there are many issues that are going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars in our prison system, and I think it's going to become a real challenge to balance those priorities to make sure that we can still take care of all the other responsibilities that come out of that general fund budget, as well as managing this ongoing crisis within our prison system.
Well, so many things to talk about. So I know Mr. Poole has to leave in just a few minutes for a hearing. So I want to touch quickly on an issue that none of you really mentioned. And I'm just curious about where you're prioritizing it. Is there's been a lot of talk about bringing the lottery up again, and what that would mean, and where would that money go, and could it be used for perhaps providing supplemental funding for retirees? That question comes up a lot, as to providing extra money for them. Is Mr. Poole, where is that? Do you know if that will come up this time?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think anybody's very sure about it right now. The governor's commission that studied gaming, and I think kind of my understanding of the intent of that was to address and clear up there on what the legal issues are that surround gaming that have always been controversial and confusing, and have been one of the issues that inevitably surrounds the lottery and the gaming discussions. There is talk that a lottery proposal will come forth in the session. There is talk that a full gaming, inclusive of a lottery, but full gaming, could be presented during the session. So nobody has seen, I have not seen any proposal as it relates to those issues. So I think obviously the devil is always in the details on those. And whether this begins as a full gaming proposal pushed by proponents that falls back to a lottery as a compromise, I just don't know how that conversation is going to go. Notwithstanding that, to the other component of your question, whether you have full gaming that brings in, X amount of revenues, and or a lottery that brings in and realizes Y amount of revenues, how should the state best use those funds? And I think that will be quite a robust debate and discussion. And I think a lot of people will have a lot of opinions and would love to spend that money in the ways that they see fit. So obviously that discussion, particularly as it relates to the lottery, has typically kind of started with, do we have a scholarship program? That has been a very common use of lottery funds around the country. So that seems to be a default that many people start with in their thought processes. I will tell you that Alabama ranks dead last in the country as it relates to providing financial assistance to on a needs-based basis to postgraduate students, whether those are 2-year or 4-year students. And when I say we're last, we're not even close to being next to last. We're last by a long shot, and we've attempted to move that needle some. So, my position would be that I think it is very important, particularly with the cost of tuition as it is today, recognizing the median incomes across our state, trying to increase attainment rates, that we should have at least a substantial component, I think, should go, in my judgment, to needs-based scholarshiping for 2- and 4-year degrees. Now, beyond that, I think there can be a host of potential expenditures. You've touched on one. Some have proposed funding pre-K. We're not 100% funded on pre-K. Many people feel that's very important to the future of our state. I agree that it's important. We're funding it very aggressively in the education budget, increasing that on an annual basis. I'm not sure that really should be funded by lottery proceeds, frankly. Some think you should just put the funds into the education and or the general fund budget. So I think that there will be a lot of discussion. The lottery comes up every year, hadn't passed yet. I tell folks, I think that it is inevitable as it relates to a lottery. I'm not sure what the broader gaming prospects are. But is this the year for the lottery? I don't know. And it has always been unclear. The debate has really not gotten to the point in great detail of what do you do with the funds, because it's really never crossed that threshold. Although, I and many others have worked and anticipate, should it ever cross that threshold, let's don't be caught unprepared. And I think it would be important as part of a lottery or a gaming proposal to be clear to the voters how those dollars are going to be used. I think it would be unfair to voters to say, we would like for you to approve this that's going to generate this money, and we'll just figure out how to spend that money later. I don't think that would be positive. So I know I didn't give you maybe a very clear answer, but I don't think that there is a clear answer.
Yeah. Well, as you said, it comes up every year. So I guess we'll just wait and see. Mr. England and Mr. South, did you have anything to add to that before we move on?
Actually, Kyle has been doing a lot of work on that too, because there's been some suggestion that some of this money could go to the general fund. But I think one of the things that Bill mentioned, I think is huge, is the devil's in the details. Because many people believe that we pass a bill and then the very next day they can go to a 7-Eleven somewhere and buy a lottery ticket. And it's really a lot more complicated than that. First and foremost, we're amending the Constitution. So that in and of itself delays it at least a year, possibly 2, maybe even 3, depending on what election cycle we're in. That's the first. But the second is there will have to be additional legislation that you pass along with the constitutional amendment that will authorize it, control it, determine where the money goes, and determine the rules around it. One of the things that we've seen across the country is once the legislation is enacted, and there's always a goal for the money, but it always magically changes when it becomes law. That's first. But then secondly, what you start seeing is that the cost of managing it, the cost of also advertising it, and all these things that you use to determine how to do it start costing money as well, and it starts eating away at some of the profit that you thought you were going to generate. And then also, there's also this other ancillary issues around it, like, do we do it ourselves? Do we pay somebody to manage it for us? And then again, where does it go? Because I think I think I speak for Kyle and Bill here. Y'all don't trust us with money, period. So in order to say, we're going to generate a good bit of more money off of you to go buy a lottery ticket, and we're going to spend it, on education. I mean, most that will not be acceptable for most people. And I think, and the sad thing is, and the place where it needs to go to the most is in the general fund. But if we if we told you beforehand and said that we're going to pass a lottery and that money's going to the general fund, it would never pass. I mean, I wouldn't put money on it at all, because everybody always associates the lottery with education, with scholarships, as Bill mentioned, pre-K and many other things. No one ever suggests that, we're going to pass a lottery to build prisons. And if that was ever said, it's dead. Are we going to pass a lottery to pay for healthcare? It's dead. So, so we'll probably again have the discussion for like the 100th year in a row, and we'll probably take some of the wisdom that was generated off of the governor's gaming commission that we just had. But honestly, the gaming commission gave us the same answer that we've had for the last 10 years. It's going to cost money to make us money. Is it worth it? And where is the money going to go? So, but I'm going to yield the balance of my time to the expert on this issue, Kyle South, because he has also been chasing this rabbit for a long time too. So.
And before Kyle begins, if I may, Kim, I need to depart, and
Yes.
I apologize that I have to leave the call early today, but certainly I appreciate all of you and Kim putting this together and allowing this opportunity. And I, for one, like the lunch format. I'll let Chris and Kyle speak for themselves, but this works well, and I think provides a nice informal way to have a discussion. So thank you all very much. Everybody be safe. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Mr. South, what do you?
So to Chris's point, I think, my take from the commission's report back to the governor is we have identified maybe several of the hurdles that make us realize, and make the public maybe realize the issues that go far beyond just a basic lottery. And I think that's the stumbling block that we faced in past discussions about the lottery, that we want to bring in all of this other, maybe the other types of gaming into that conversation, but yet we're trying to do it in silos. And to be honest with you, I don't think as a legislature, anybody has the appetite to take more than one bite at this apple. So I think as we move forward, in order to make all the different kind of, I don't know how to put it, but the different groups and the groups within the legislature happy, we're going to have to come with a comprehensive plan rather than trying to do it within those silos. So I think that report pointed some of that out, and we've got to dive deeper into it before we can ever think about how we're going to spend the money.
Yeah, and I think one point that needs to be made, and he said that when Kyle identified the silos, there are two very different camps in this. There are people who don't want any at all, nothing at all. And we fought about fantasy sports as a form of gambling is against those folks who don't want any form of sort of gaming at all. But when he mentioned silos, I mean, we're talking about people that will tolerate a lottery, but will not tolerate full gaming. And you've also got a group that will tolerate it all, but want to do it in a way that doesn't give our direct competition, Native Americans, the ability to dominate the business in Alabama. I mean, so when we talk, and then there are federal regulations that go along with this too. So this is a comprehensive bear that we're trying to embark upon. And unfortunately for us, as we've worked our way slowly towards whatever the eventual conclusion is going to be, the states that surround us have not waited, and Mississippi and Tennessee and many others have adopted their lottery, which also impacts our ability to do the same. So, there are just a whole host of issues that have that as we continue to have this discussion are making it more and more obvious that, you know, at some point we will have something, but it probably will not bear the same amount of fruit as many people imagine it will. So
Yeah. So more to come is what I hear.
a lot more,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's move on to a topic that's near and dear to the league's heart anyway. So voter registration, especially this year with the pandemic and which sort of made voting difficult, the logistics of it. You know, Alabama does not allow for your typical mail-in or early voting. Do you see, or I guess, what do you see coming up this legislative session that might address those concerns and perhaps propel us to the next level in voting access? Mr. Scott, or any, yeah, England, Mr. England, go ahead.
Nothing. I mean, just judging by the tone of the conversation across the country, and some of the things that have been said about elections in other states, I sincerely doubt you'll see. I mean, there'll be some discussion of it. I'm not going to say this 100% closed, because I think there are many people who recognize that, you know, maybe expanding absentee balloting, since we have some sort of system in place already, like we can replicate and expand upon. And if we just invested a little bit more resources in it, it could handle the load of people being able to, you know, vote absentee. But as far as a full-on expansion of just everybody can mail in vote, and also an expansion of, you know, same-day registration and many of the other things that you're seeing across the country, just based upon the tone of the debate in the past in Alabama, I think the likelihood is, if you see any advances in election or voting access or expansion of voting access, it'll be married with some sort of election integrity measure. And, you know, I'm not going to be disingenuous here. Election integrity and election and expanding access have to go hand in hand. And one of the things in Alabama that we don't do is we don't audit our elections. Other states do, we don't. So our full faith and confidence is just in the numbers that are produced at the end of the night, but we don't have a mechanism that goes back and audits to make sure that the machines are counting the same, the numbers that are produced by the machines are actually what's being counted. So I think you'll have some discussion about that. I think actually Secretary Merrill last year and the year before proposed legislation that would create sort of like a study group to begin the process of doing election auditing, because I think that's one of the ways you guarantee that your elections are secure, they have integrity, and the results are accurate. But also, when we have that discussion, we're also going to, you know, have a discussion, and I know on my side of the aisle, of trying to increase and expand voter access, which means including things like no excuse absentee balloting, also mail-in voting, early voting, and things of that sort. So I think there will be a very robust discussion of it. I think some people will probably try to go too far both ways, but I'm not exactly optimistic that you're going to see any real just, you know, expansion as you've seen in other places.
Adding on to that, Mr. South, before you answer, is what about improving the restoration of voting rights by felons? You know, is that, I mean, that's on the, it's slightly the same, but a little different.
Yeah, so I think something that'll make Chris happy to hear me say is the first step in that is getting pardons and paroles to doing their job. So I think that may be a step in the right direction when it comes to access for past felons and those kinds of things. So, but I agree with everything he said when it comes to election laws and those kinds of things. I think it's a chance for us to take a step back, look how it worked in November when it comes to no, not having to have an excuse for an absentee, et cetera, et cetera. And then we methodically move forward, both in the security side of it and the access side of it.
And I want to make sure we point this out about felon disenfranchisement. Alabama actually took a massive step forward a few years ago that many of our sister states have not. And we still have ways to go, but we substantially limited the cases that arbitrarily take away someone's right to vote. And that was actually a bipartisan effort where both Republicans and Democrats came together and limited the cases that would take away someone's right to vote based upon a criminal conviction. It used to be hundreds, and it used to be just where you could go in any one of our 67 counties and the clerk could unilaterally make a decision that today this particular criminal charge has an element of moral turpitude, and I will not allow you to register to vote. We actually created a framework across the state, put the list of charges. And yes, it is still a very long list, but it's not nearly as long as it was many years ago, where, again, a clerk had the power to unilaterally decide what a case of moral turpitude was and you just take away your right to vote without a hearing, without due process, and without a way to get that done. So now we've limited to about 50. Again, it's still too long. And personally, I don't see a rational relationship between criminal conviction and voting rights, but we're actually making progress in the right direction, in my opinion. But as Representative Kyle mentioned, our pardons and parole system is broken. And our pardon system is possibly 5 or maybe 4,000 people behind in granting pardons. And part of that pardon issue is, some of those individuals who are charged with offenses that are still carry when you lose your right to vote, they're behind too. And at this point, when they do have hearings, which is maybe 2 or 3 times a week, they're only having 10 to 15 pardon hearings every time they gather. So that group is disenfranchising people, and it's going to take some significant work to bring them up to speed, to get them the resources that are necessary so they can do their job and get them and work on that backlog. But ultimately, I am happy to say that Alabama has made progress. And recently, in Florida, there's a distinction between Florida and Alabama in the sense that as long as you owe money, you can't have your rights restored in Florida. In Alabama, the crucial difference is the cost associated has to be from your initial offense. So nothing that you accrued while you're incarcerated can keep you from voting. So that's a substantial difference between Alabama and Florida. And again, we're making progress.
I'm interested in the pardon and parole thing now. So Mr. South, is it a money issue? Is it a personnel issue? Do they just need more money, or are the people who are on the pardon and parole board not stepping up? I mean, I don't. So what is your take on where the logjam is there?
D, all of the above. And I will defer part of that question to Chris, because he's been staying on their case pretty well. I do think that it was a personnel issue to some extent. I think we've taken a step to maybe put somebody with a little bit more, will I say, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but I think we've taken a step in the right direction to kind of move forward. We know we've got a lot of issues over there, and we've made some changes recently. The governor appointed a new pardons and parole director that hopefully can start to begin the process to clean that up.
Yeah, it's an all of the above sort of problem. Kyle was quite diplomatic in what he said. I won't be. The last guy needed to go. And what's interesting about it is we always say that everything is underfunded in Alabama, and it's true. From a general fund perspective, we generally don't have enough money to fund a lot of the operations. But the Department of Corrections and the Pardons and Parole is one of those organizations where the more money we throw at it, the worse results we've been getting. And we've appropriated millions of dollars to hire personnel, and not just within the facilities themselves, but also to supervise those that are released. We appropriated $40 to $50 million several years ago to start that process, and we found out, if I'm not mistaken, they really haven't spent any of that money. We've also increased every year for the past 5 or 6 years. We've had substantial increases in the amount of money we've given the Department of Corrections, and the results from that organization have actually gotten worse. And leads me to say the same thing I've been saying all the time, and I say it to Kyle too. He thinks this is funny, but it's the truth. I mean, like, what does it take to get fired around here? That Department of Corrections situation has spiraled to a point where the Department of Justice is telling us that being inside of our prison system is worse than the death penalty. And it's continued to get worse. That's the crux of the argument. The argument is that our prison system and the conditions within it violate the Constitution to the point where being in it is cruel and unusual punishment. To put that in context, the death penalty, putting somebody to death, is not cruel and unusual punishment, but the Department of Justice is arguing that being in an Alabama prison is. And we've gotten to this point under the same leadership. So that's one, but two, a pardons and parole situation isn't happening it's not happening within a vacuum. Our sentencing structure, Alabama is one of the easiest places, not just in the country, but in the world, to end up with life without parole. We've done things to address that. Actually, we've passed several bills recently to kind of recategorize some criminal offenses to make it more difficult for someone to end up serving life without parole. But it still happens. And that's a large, substantial portion of our population that can't get out. So if we continue to produce and incarcerate individuals at the rate that we are, but ultimately our Bureau of Pardons and Paroles only releases at the most now a couple of hundred people a month, you can start to see how the model itself is unsustainable. So it's only going to contribute to overcrowding, which means that we're also going to put ourselves in a situation where we can't manage the population, and we're going to get ourselves in further trouble with the federal government. So when you talk about the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, there's some systemic issues within it in terms of setting up subjective standards based upon who's in front of them, who gets released and who doesn't. We've taken on an arbitrary standard between violent and nonviolent offenders, because just because you committed a violent offense doesn't mean you're a violent offender. So we can't continue, as you make application for parole and go in front of the board, we can't continue to treat you as the same person that you were when you committed the offense. Otherwise, why do we continue to invest money in we're trying to rehabilitate individuals to prepare them for their eventual release? And then also, most importantly, the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles is not determining on most cases if they can get out. They're determining when. And just imagine if you're talking about your goal of public safety, and that's what's most important to you, you obviously don't want somebody to serve their entire sentence, because if they do, they EOS, they end a sentence, they get out, and they don't have any supervision at all. So you got to balance that. I mean, you got to say, well, we want you to be punished, but we also, the goal of any system should be to rehabilitate to the point where you don't reoffend. And our system is failing in that. As a matter of fact, if you ask anybody working at the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles, they will tell you that they have no confidence in the ability of the Department of Corrections to rehabilitate someone, which means that the two most important components of our system are fighting against each other. And the only people that suffer are the people who are in the system and the constituents, us, whose safety is sacrificed because neither one of those components are doing their jobs effectively and efficiently. So, I mean, it is a comprehensive problem that is going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. And ultimately, the money that we're spending right now isn't even addressing those issues. So.
Well, we'll move on to another cheery topic. Maybe a little cheerier. Payday lending. So I know a year or so ago, there was legislation passed to try to improve the payday lending situation in Alabama. Do you foresee any additional legislation coming up this time that will continue on that improvement path? Or do you think, is that a dead topic? Mr. South, do you know anything about that?
Inevitably, something will come up every year about that, minor changes, major changes, those kinds of things. One thing that I will pass along that's very positive is the number of those providers in the state has significantly decreased through the legislation that we passed 2 or 3 years ago. So I think we've taken steps in the right direction. Whether it's enough, to completely overhaul, I don't know, but I think we're seeing results. So now whether that needs to be tweaked going forward, I think we have to keep a close watch on how that's moving.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. England, did you want to add anything before we?
No, I mean, I think he hit the nail on the head. We're always going to see legislation, but I think it's not as nearly as fast as we would hope it to be, but we have made progress in that regard. And one of the things that Kyle mentioned is that many of those businesses are not finding it nearly as lucrative to locate in Alabama as it has been in the past. So they are relocating in other places, which ultimately is better for the communities that surround them currently. So I think you'll probably see some more bills introduced, but at least, over the past few years, it's been very difficult for us to say that there's been any progress made in that regard. So I'm happy to report at some point that we actually have made some progress in there, but I think we still have some work to do.
Good. Well, that's good news. So let's talk about reapportionment and redistricting a little bit. It's a census year, so we expect there might be some redistricting. Do you think there will be a bipartisan committee developed to do that? Has there been any early talks about how that will be handled?
Yeah, actually there is. There's a bipartisan committee that's been appointed to deal with it. It's obviously it's proportional based upon membership.
Mm-hmm.
Since there are more Republicans than Democrats, or more Republicans than Democrats on these reapportionment committees, but we have one that's been constituted. And if I'm not mistaken, Kyle, we're probably going to a special session this year to do that. Yeah. So
yeah, looking at least one, if not two special sessions. And I think the factor in all of that is the fact that the census was delayed somewhat. And we may not get final numbers until too late in the session to actually be able to take it up during this regular session. So kind of the thought process is that we would have a special session sometime during the summer to deal with reapportionment, maybe one for state reapportionment, but then another for congressional, and still questions up in the air whether we have to factor in a loss of a congressional seat and those kinds of things. So still a lot to be determined, but knowing that we're going to have to deal with that at some point during this year.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, there's a possibility that the new president could extend the window and allow us to continue counting. So that could delay us even further. And we will not do any work in regards to redistricting until we actually have numbers. Because otherwise it's impossible. And as Kyle mentioned, there has been some optimism that we will not lose a seat, but we will not know that until we finish counting.
So you said that would be handled in a special session, and there might be another special session. What would that topic be? Do you?
Well, I've actually been through one redistricting, I think. I think I'm aging myself now, but that was 10 years ago. And it was done in a special session within the session. Because it's more important really to kind of isolate that work, because it is exhausting. It takes a lot. We actually have, and I think the Republican caucus, Democratic caucus, the state itself, and the people who put the work together actually have their own employees, because, again, it produces a map, but it's actually a bill. It's a piece of legislation, and it's like the hundreds
900
of
pages.
yeah, it's like 500 pages long. And as an interesting side note, in the last election, in the last session regarding redistricting, as generally happens, Republicans, Democrats get to fussing at each other. And one of the delay tactics that are used in these situations is we get people to read the bill. So it took, I don't remember how long it took, maybe 6 hours, 7 hours.
Keep going up.
Yeah, about 10 hours to read a bill. And because I don't even remember how that happened, to be honest with you.
So what, Chris, I don't mean to interrupt, but what
Go
he's
ahead.
alluding to was due to the lawsuits that were filed against the last reapportionment. We had to come back and redraw the maps in 2014
Yeah.
for the 2010 census. And it was a 913 page bill, if I'm not mistaken, that took almost 12 hours to read aloud. So it was a pretty miserable time to be in the state legislature to listen to all the blocks that had to be read over the
Yeah.
loudspeaker. So, but yes, the multiple special sessions that I was referring to would actually be to put into silos state redistricting, and then maybe in a separate special session do congressional redistricting, so that those lines don't get blurred.
Gotcha.
And that also reminded me that when we did it in 2010, it was a successful lawsuit filed to put us back in another special session. And interestingly enough, before Kyle got there, we did not have a bill reading machine. So the person, the clerk actually has to sit there and read every page, every line of the bill. But now we have a machine that they put it in, and it reads for us. But we can't leave. We have to be there. So that was 10. We had to stay there for 10 hours while that happened. It was something else.
Wow. Okay. All right. So I guess perhaps our healthcare situation has been I don't know, how do I say this? Well, COVID has really put a spotlight on it, and we've lost a lot of rural hospitals, and rural healthcare in general isn't very good. There's been some talk of expanding the scope of nurse practitioners and having them assist with telemedicine and that kind of thing. Do you guys, how do you feel about that? Do you know, are there other things on the horizon to help deal with these healthcare issues that we have in our state?
If you don't mind, I want to take this one, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to step away afterwards, and I apologize. But so with all the bad that COVID has brought to our nation, to the world, to our state, that has affected so many people, it has brought a couple of positive things. And I think probably the most positive things is the reimbursement through Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance for telemedicine. That is probably the biggest and most positive thing that's happened for rural medicine in a long time. And so we fully expect that to continue forward even after the pandemic is gone. And I think that will help considerably. I do think you're right. The nurse practitioners have become a big part of rural healthcare, and maybe we need to look at how we can improve that through them, but other aspects as well. But telemedicine is the way of the future. It allows us access to regional hospitals, those kinds of things, and it is a big key when we look at the pieces of the puzzle for rural healthcare.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been one of the many things that have been revealed about Alabama is our delivery system was flawed, and we quickly addressed that because obviously not being able to go to hospitals if you don't have one or if you don't have access to one. We've identified that our infrastructure issues needed to be addressed immediately, and we've done a lot to do that. We also did a lot with partnerships between the state and Blue Cross Blue Shield specifically in order to increase access to telemedicine and to remove some of the red tape so people who came to the state could immediately start providing care and not have to go through all these other things that they had to use, licensing issues and so forth. So we have actually deployed people on the ground immediately to a lot of these places. But as you know, and I think many people know, our hospital system is now just completely, it is completely overwhelmed. And our system, again, has been exposed as being very ill-equipped in our ability to respond to those things. So I do think you will see a serious look at that on the general fund budget. And continuing to explore how we provide those services. As Anna pointed out quite eloquently, you can't deliver babies by Zoom. So we're going to have to figure out a way to reinvest in those areas that lost those hospitals so people don't have to go an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, to get emergency care. And one of the things about preventative care and getting and increasing our health outcomes is that when you don't have access to a primary care physician or a hospital, the likelihood that you take a small ailment that could be treated and not become a major ailment diminishes tremendously. So we could actually save a lot more money on the front end if you increased actual access to healthcare for more people. So I think you'll see now, especially now, if we ever get to the other side of this pandemic, Alabama will have to take a significant look at, the fact that we've already lost the hospitals, but also how do we respond in rural areas to actually provide some substantial healthcare access to people who've been, just denied for whatever reason.
Yeah. So, Mr.
Agree
South,
with Chris. It's going to be a process that is ongoing, those kinds of things. But wanted to take just a second to thank y'all again for allowing me to be with you. I look forward to further communication with you. And if I can ever be of an assistance to any of you on any topic, please let me know. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, Mr. England, we'll just ask just a couple more questions here if you have time. Okay.
Of course.
So, healthcare isn't the only area that has been stressed by COVID. Of course, education has been as well, with lots of students doing remote learning and really being challenged because they don't have good internet connectivity. So what steps are being taken? I know the state has talked some, I think they use some CARES funding, CARES Act funding to try and help sort of widen the net there. But is there any long-term or more permanent solutions being discussed?
Yeah. So we've tried in the past to pass legislation that created incentives for individuals to deploy wireless infrastructure to rural areas in Alabama because there are still virtual deserts for many resources, whether it be healthcare, roads, bridges, many environmental concerns, but also, access to broadband. So we did spend some CARES Act money to address some immediate concerns. But as far as long-term is concerned, we have created a plan, or there is a plan in place in order to offer incentives for your major providers to go into these rural areas, maybe cutting some of the costs, and also providing incentives for them to build out in those areas. But interestingly enough, is in Alabama, in many things, you have so many different competing interests that it becomes very difficult when the state itself doesn't have the ability to I guess, have any ability to manage those relationships. And what I mean is, one of the things that's in every area of the state are power lines and poles. So, I mean, Alabama Power is everywhere. And many people are trying to create these sort of relationships where we use the current infrastructure to deploy our services in those areas, right? But if you could imagine let's say you go to a rural area and there's in a 2-mile radius, there are 5 homes. The cost to build out to those 5 homes in those areas, when you have to negotiate pole usage with Alabama Power, which could cost you a gang of money, but then those customers may not be able to pay enough in bills, or you can't charge them enough in order to substantiate the investment in that area. So the state tries to close that gap a little bit by providing incentives for you to locate there. But when you look at the numbers, that the last mile, where you getting to that point where the fewer customers, but the most cost, it's almost prohibitively expensive. So we're not going to be able to get to that point without some substantial investment by the state of Alabama. And when I talked about earlier about those priorities in our general fund, and what's going to start balancing and also pulling away at those dollars, it's also trying to do something about that substantial digital divide that creates systemic differences between people based upon race and also location, that I don't know if you can throw enough money at that in order to try to equalize the playing field in that regard. Because it is, when you see the numbers just on paper, it is almost prohibitively expensive to ask a private company, a smaller private company, to go into these rural areas where there are a lot of people, but not nearly enough to cover the cost of the work they're going to have to do to get there. So again, it's going to cost, the state of Alabama is going to have to invest a good bit of money to make sure to try to bridge that digital divide.
I know there's I'm going to call it, I don't know the exact title, forgive me, an innovation commission or something. Mm-hmm. Is that something they're considering as well to make Alabama more marketable? And how, I mean, are they looking at ways we can even use cellular technology, or just, I mean, anything? Is that sort of in their purview as well?
Yes. Yeah. Really, it's all, we're not discriminating against any idea or any way to get it done. But as in most things in Alabama, the problem isn't necessarily identifying the problem. The problem is addressing it, meaning that you've got so many people who can make money off of these things, who actually have more of an impact on how these things are drafted and how they're done practically than the legislators and the people that we serve. Again, the money that's involved in it, whereas where somebody could create a piece of legislation that eliminates their competition, so to speak. Those are one of those things that you always have to kind of keep an eye on, because when the industry writes the legislation, they're obviously not doing it for the greater good. They're doing it because they're trying to make sure that they can protect their profit and eliminate their competition. But as we all know, and monopolies, especially in situations like that, are not good for the consumer, not at all. So we've got to, again, that's why I think it's going to be necessary for the state of Alabama, through whatever means that we can come up with, to equalize that playing field, to make it profitable for all companies to build out in rural areas, but also to protect competition so it keeps the cost down for those folks, because the likelihood is they can't pay much money for it anyway. So again, that's why I think it's absolutely necessary and unavoidable, actually, that the state gets involved in that, to make it lucrative and possible at the same time.
So I think we have time for just maybe one last question. So this is probably not a very easy question to answer, but what about improving government transparency and ability to have open records? And what is the legislature doing about that? What do you think we should do about that to sort of help all of us have better information?
You know,
I throw you a softball at the end.
well, I mean, it's just, to be honest with you, it's obviously much easier to get away with things when no one is watching. It's obviously much easier to get away with things when we make records almost prohibitively expensive to get a hold of. It's also much more difficult. It's almost a lot easier to get away with things when we limit access to the public. There have been many bills that have been sponsored and introduced and sponsored in the legislature that tried to attempt to create as much sunlight on our process as possible. Because you've seen in the past when somebody requests information from a state organization or a city or a county, and you get a bill for $1,000 for whatever record you're trying to seek, it does have an impact on whether or not you're going to pursue that. And if a governing body knows that they can just continue to make the process as difficult as possible so they can hide nefarious activity, that is exactly what they're going to do. So we Senator Warren introduced legislation that expanded the Open Meetings and Open Records Act that would create punishments for individuals who seek to stop the free spread of information, put time limits on it, actually we eliminate those general rules of exclusion that people use, whether it be because it's part of an investigation or something like that. So you have to have some sort of substantial reason for that particular document or that meeting doesn't need to have the public involved. And again, I said it earlier, and I don't think this is a controversial statement. The public doesn't trust politicians. I mean, I don't think that's controversial. I think that's a given. Like, that's a universal truth at this point. And it isn't like we haven't earned that. I don't know if you remember, but around this time last year, when the CARES Act money was being discussed, we were getting ready. There were some people who were thinking that we were going to take some of the CARES Act money and build a new state house. So I think we've earned the public scrutiny in regards to how we spend money. So I'm going to continue to support legislation that provides as much access to public records and public meetings as possible. But of course, I'm just one person. And if it's in the best interest of the body itself, and they believe so, to continue to hide information and make it difficult, and obviously it tells you the likelihood that a bill like that will pass. So.
Well, keep on trying. So.
Oh, we will.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it, as always. This is, our annual event, and we love hearing from you guys. So we wish you well this session. Hope everything goes okay. So
I also want to tell you, make sure you're all safe. I know we all want to, go out and celebrate a new president next week. But the threats that you mentioned earlier are real. And so just be careful and celebrate responsibly, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yes. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And we will hope to hear from you soon.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes. And thanks to everyone who watched us live.